know leaders in STEM and gain confidence and valuable advice on how to pursue a career in your chosen field. Learn the steps to turn your dream into a reality. Call 949-0006 or email frc@gov.ky.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Cawdery and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio this morning by Adam Butler. Adam, of course, is Chief Investment Officer at Resolve Asset Management right here in the Cayman Islands and an occasional host of Money Sense. So Adam, thank you and good morning.
It's a delight to be a substitute guest here this morning.
Adam's referring to, we're trying to pin a couple of ministers down to come in and tell us a few things that are going on, but schedules inevitably clash. So we're hoping to get a couple of ministers on to inform us in due course. But Adam has gamely stepped up and is going to tell us about Cayman's latest public policy announcements. No, we're going to go into a completely different direction. Adam, the topic that's on my mind, I've written in my show notes, the topic that seems to be on everyone's mind. I don't know about everybody, so the topic that's on my mind, and it was for most of 2023, was this recession imminent subject. It was always talked about. It was always speculated. It was, oh, well, the Fed's going to have to start cutting rates because there's going to be this recession. We're all going to be out of jobs. We're all going to find ourselves unable to pay our debt. And there's an indicator, the New York Fed for the last 40 years or so has been publishing an indicator which looks at a whole variety of things, and it gives a probability of a recession in the next 12 months or so. Since 1980, it's done a pretty accurate job of forecasting either a recession or a somewhat unpleasant slowdown. It's never had a probability as high as it has today. So in 40 years, it's never had such a high probability of forecasting, of expecting a recession. And yet, everything continues as though the world's fine. So what are we all missing? What am I missing, perhaps, is the better question.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we're both missing a lot because the economy is a highly complex and dynamic system, and it's constantly changing and being affected by the agents who are anticipating what the economy is going to have in store for us next. And I would argue it's never been more complex than it is today, or at least it hasn't been this complex in decades. A big reason for that is that for 40 years, since about 1982, after Paul Volcker conquered the inflation of the 1970s, we've been in a fairly persistent disinflationary environment where successively after each cycle, the inflation rate or the sort of equilibrium inflation rate kept getting lower and lower. We had, you may recall, or we probably weren't active in markets at this point, but in the early 80s, inflation rates were often in the high single digits. In the very early 80s, they were in the low double digits, the low teens. And since then, it's been coming down. The best investment somebody could have made in late 1981 wasn't in U.S. equities, but it was in 30-year Treasury bonds, which for subsequent 40 years through 2021 had a much higher absolute return than any global equity market with much lower volatility, right? So it was a very easy time in relative terms for policymakers to navigate the economy because they're only needing to manage it through one dimension, and that was the growth dimension. They could really just watch employment and GDP measures to see whether the economy was healthy, because they just didn't need to worry about inflation. Contrast that with the environment we're in now post-COVID. There's a wide variety of different hypotheses or theories about why inflation has reared its ugly head again post-COVID. And it's probably an amalgamation or mosaic of all of them. You did have supply disruptions. You did have a massive demand shock when government mailed out all the checks to supplement employment income when they sent everyone home from work.
Car prices suddenly went crazy, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And we have, a much more violent geopolitical climate now than we had, 5 years ago. We've got a war in the Middle East. We've got the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine obviously affecting the distribution of a wide variety of different commodities through both Ukraine and Russia, and the war in the Middle East disrupting supply chains through mostly in Europe via the Houthis' activity against shipping lines. And this is likely to continue to escalate. We seem to be sort of in a more violent, conflict-ridden period of history. And so now the Fed needs to figure out how to navigate both inflation expectations and growth expectations in the economy. And where it's very easy to navigate, two people on a seesaw, this is very different than try to navigate two people on a board that's resting on the top of a ball. And I think that's a much more apt metaphor for the difference in complexity of policymakers, and therefore the signals and models that they use to signal whether or not we're in an inflationary environment or a growth environment or a deflationary environment, like, for example, the New York Fed model is currently signaling.
And you mentioned, we mentioned New York, and I'm minded of recent news flow out of New York, in fact, New York Commercial Bank Corp. So those who aren't familiar, it's a regional, I guess you want to call it a regional bank. It operates predominantly in the New York area, and it's highly exposed to the residential and commercial space. It lends to companies, it lends to apartment complexes. It's commercial, residential lending. And that industry has been obviously pretty badly hurt post-COVID, working from home, the change in dynamics. But it leads to a question, which is perhaps there is thinking of an economy-wide recession is the wrong context to be thinking of what might be ahead, because we've got, more so than perhaps in any time in our lives, we've got a bifurcating economy where you might well see 40, 50, 60% of the economy in recession, but you might equally see 10 or 15% doing very, very well. And then somehow another 20, wherever my maths got to on that, the balance sort of muddling through. So for more than half the population, it might easily feel like we're in a recession because they're in areas which are wage pressure, they're seeing inflationary pressure eating away at real wages. And then on the other side of the equation, you've got people in the AI, the tech space, who are doing incredibly well. I suppose the stock market's a realization of that in some respects, where the top 7 stocks have contributed something like 80-90% of the gains over the past year and a half, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this has been a much more sustained phenomenon. This cycle has been really unique in a variety of ways, but one of them is how long this concentrated group of stocks in a very narrow sector of the economy has dominated all of the other stocks in the index, and has really glossed over a lot of the frictions and challenges that are, small businesses, medium-sized businesses are experiencing in the real economy, trying to adjust to this large spike in input costs, right? And to the perspective of the average household who's having to deal with a near 30% increase in food prices. We're now, over the last 3 months, we've seen a major uptick in gasoline prices that has a major impact on household budgets. And I think it's very reasonable to say that we are in a very bifurcated economy.
I saw a statistic, let's say Tuesday, that came out of, I think, the Federal Reserve, talking about consumer debt. And in general, households have done really quite well over the last 15 years from a debt perspective. The amount of debt they have encapsulated in the property market because of property price rises and because of the ability of people 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago to lock in 30-year mortgages, in the US this is, to lock in 30-year mortgages at as close to zero as they've ever been. So consumer debt in that sense has been really good for the last 10 years or so. But very recently, there's been this, when I read it, seemed to me quite an unpleasant and worrying indicator, which was the amount of debt that people have on credit cards and the amount of debt that people have in other loans which are unsecured, say a car loan, something like that, has gone up a lot. And also the rate of interest on those loans has gone up an awful lot. So you multiply an increase in loans that are growing and an increase in interest rates on those growing loans, and you start to see a problem from a consumer spending ability. So people buying cars and they're suddenly seeing their debt costs go up by 40, 50%. That augurs quite poorly for people being able to buy cars in the future. And that's perhaps a symptom of this bifurcating economy, isn't it?
Absolutely. One thing that often goes overlooked because it wasn't really a factor for the last several decades is the size of government deficits right now. I mean, since 2020, when we started to react to the upcoming pandemic, we've been running on average deficits in the low teens. For several years, it was sort of 10 or 12% of the GDP of the entire U.S. economy. And we saw similar reactions from governments around the world was coming out in the form of stimulus. And while that number has dropped from the low teens percentage to the sort of mid-single digits, 6-7%, 6-7% is still about twice the average annual deficit as a percentage of GDP that we experienced in the two decades prior. So while the households may be under pressure from a price increase and wages not yet catching up to the major surge in prices that we've experienced over the last 3-4 years, government has more than stepped in with massive spending bills. And a lot of these spending bills, or a lot of the spending in these bills, is being channeled to areas of the economy that the U.S. hasn't really been investing in for the past couple of decades. There's a massive resurgence in building in the industrial sector, a lot of it in the chip sector. We're trying to re-onshore a lot of the strategic manufacturing that we spent the last 2 decades outsourcing to the Asian tigers and China and to Western Europe. And so in many ways, the manufacturing sector, bolstered by major government stimulus, is sort of obfuscating the weakness that we are experiencing in the household sector, as evidenced by so many of the indicators that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and the question when talks about debt like that, the conventional wisdom 20 years ago in the textbooks was governments can't continue borrowing money ad infinitum because markets will react unfavorably and do something about it. But then we came up with this concept of being able to print money and it not really creating inflation. So that was always the counterbalance. Governments can always borrow as much, they can print as much as they want, but it causes this inflation. But then it didn't. And then Japan sort of went a little bit crazy and kept on borrowing forever and ever, and they never saw any inflation whatsoever. So what has sort of conventional economics got wrong about this? Or is it simply a phenomena associated with where we are in the world, whereby these disinflationary pressures have upturned conventional economics because they've had a more powerful force?
I think where the dominant in economic theory, neoclassical economics, went wrong is that there's no accounting for the finance sector or the banking sector in neoclassical economics. And what we've observed over the last, certainly since the global financial crisis, and I think you could argue since Greenspan bailed out long-term capital management in the late 90s, is that the Federal Reserve does a lot of the heavy lifting that fiscal stimulus have done in previous generations. And when the Federal Reserve buys financial assets, it inflates the value of financial assets, but it doesn't really affect very directly prices or output or demand in the real economy. And so the vast majority of the stimulus that we've seen out of the Federal Reserve and their security purchases just sort of resides in this cloud of financial asset prices and hasn't really impacted the real economy. We're starting to see now, given the more active role of the Treasury and governments in actually spending into the economy now we're really starting to see the impact of inflationary pressures as this money actually hits the economy rather than staying up in the sort of finance cloud.
Well, look, let's take a brief break there. Rejoin us in 60 seconds and we'll continue our conversation with Adam Butler.
At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
This is Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense, where I'm joined today by the esteemed and erstwhile Adam Butler. That was my thesaurus effort for this morning. We were discussing a veritable range of topics, notably a bifurcation in the economy. There being growth areas, very good growth areas, and then this area of, well, not many people doing very well. And another area on that I want to touch on with you, Adam, is you shared with me an article, and I want to get your take on it. And the article was trying to illustrate how much wealth had been generated over the decades by people investing in property. So our parents, people in their 70s or 80s, shall we say, who have invested in their home and they've made an awful lot of wealth for themselves, not because of sensible investing or clever investing, perhaps because they got lucky, because that's what happened. That's what generated all the wealth, a lot of the wealth over time. But the affordability now for somebody new in the economy, getting out of university, starting a job, the affordability of buying the same equivalent type of house that we would have bought or our parents would have bought at the same sort of age has gone completely crazy. So what does that mean for future generations' ability to save, to invest, and to live the same sort of fairly lavish lifestyle that we've all become accustomed to because of the gains that we've had in financial assets?
I think this is a dominant theme for our time. And I mean, I have 3 children, one of whom is 18, another who's turning 17 next week, and one who's 13. So I think about this a lot. They're going to very soon be out of the house trying to stand up.
Is that what you think about most? Thank goodness they're going to be out of the house.
Actually, I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet, but I'm sure I will be when the time
They're listening,
comes.
going, please, Dad, let us go.
That's right. But I wonder where, if they wanted to settle in a major urban center where historically, and I think we could argue still, many of the more interesting jobs are located, then
particularly where many of the training opportunities are, perhaps. If you think of the financial sector, the legal sector, the accounting sector, you have to go to a lot of those major locations to learn your craft.
Exactly.
You may then move somewhere else, but it's difficult. Even in Cayman, it's difficult to learn your craft as a lawyer or as an accountant if you haven't worked in a higher pressure, higher profile location.
Absolutely. And then you look at, many of the major urban centers in the U.S., in Canada, in Australia, in Britain, less so in many of the countries in Europe. But, boomers were able to buy their homes for somewhere near sort of 3 times their median income. Gen Xers were able to buy their homes for somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 4.5 times median income. Millennials were able to buy their homes after the 2008 financial crisis at somewhere around 4 to 5 times their median income. And the new generations, sort of post-COVID, who are trying to find their footing in the traditional idea of the middle class, are facing down home prices in major urban centers that are 7.5 times median incomes. Obviously, considerably higher than that in certain key cities like San Francisco and Toronto and Sydney and London, et cetera. And it used to be the refrain of policymakers that, well, sure, home prices have gone up, but the cost of home ownership in terms of mortgage payments hasn't really risen very much because as home prices rose, interest rates declined. Of course, the fact is home prices rose because interest rates declined. And the way that humans operate in modern society is that they consume as much as their income will support, not in terms of the fraction of their total wealth that is locked up in certain assets. And so you can't, current generations can't even adopt that sort of, I'm going to rent my home from the bank for the bulk of my life, which is kind of what the Xers and millennials
There
did.
could be two scenarios where it could work, though, couldn't it? One is further increase in longevity, meaning that your mortgage period could extend from a 25, 30 to a 35 year. So that could increase the affordability. And the other is if the future wages of those people are going to increase at a more rapid rate than we've all experienced. Now, the second is probably more challenging to expect. The first, longevity, that's more plausible, perhaps.
Maybe. I mean, mortality rates have actually kinked lower in the U.S.
In certain parts of the U.S.
And, well, on average in the U.S. I will grant that the top quartile of income earners in the U.S. continue to experience the same kind of longevity expansion as we see in other areas. But we aren't seeing longevity expansion at the same rate. That's curving lower. So unless there's a major, and there are signs of some pretty fantastic new innovations in biotech that lead one to be optimistic.
Cells, targeting tumors, targeting those things that are specific often to humans, to an individual human, as opposed to generic across the human race.
Absolutely. The question is, do you, as a young person, want to make that bet? You want to leverage your future by taking on a mortgage that consumes a lot more of your income than than previous generations were forced to consume, or extending the time it's going to take you to buy your house out by another decade or decade and a half.
You may not have a choice there.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have all made choices as a society. We've chosen consistently to favor policies that bolster the wealth of previous generations and sort of leave younger generations to twist. And it'll be interesting.
Not being voters, but I suppose being the cynical approach to that.
Well, certainly, I would argue that many young people are very cynical themselves.
Yeah.
They are not unaware of the situation that they've been left, and I think that their disenfranchisement with the decisions that have been made, where all of the good real estate in the major cities were taken up by families 50, 60 years ago. They're going to be forced to transit an hour and a half to get the same kinds of jobs that people 50, 60 years ago only had to commute 15, 20 minutes for. And they're looking at a future where their labor income is just vastly insufficient to fund the lifestyle that they were promised by previous generations. They've turned to investing or, in many cases, gambling to close that gap.
I guess one opportunity that might befall them would be a fall in house prices, making these things more affordable. So the ratio is what it is because of the level of house prices. House prices fall, but the problem with that analysis, as I see it, is that the housing market in the cities and locations you're talking about has a scarcity value. You can't, and populations are still expanding in aggregate. So if you've got increased number of people looking for property, the idea that you're going to see a sustained fall in an area where there's scarce new areas to build seems somewhat implausible, doesn't it?
The only dynamic that would lead to a material shift in the owner occupants of buildings in the central areas of cities would be a major fall in asset prices, because the people that own all that real estate have achieved their wealth status by virtue of the appreciation of that real estate and of other financial assets that they accumulated over the years. If there's a major recession or if there's a substantial correction in asset prices, it will force hard choices on many of the retired or soon to retire people that are living in those homes. And I think cause a material turnover. The other thing is, I mean, if you visit any of or a variety of the major urban centers in Europe, they have managed to achieve a remarkable success of densification without ruining the aesthetic and appeal of living in the downtown core. You know, we just happen to have chosen an urban design in the West where you've got these large single-family homes consuming a massive amount of real estate in downtown urban centers. This is the norm. You just don't see that in major cities in France, in Spain, in Germany. So, you know, that's preserved by policy. There can be other policies that incentivize densification of these urban centers, rezoning, et cetera.
Cancelling some of the zonification.
Yep.
There is one perhaps slightly more controversial policy. I'll throw it out there just for your thinking. Is a huge amount of wealth has been earned by boomers, as you say, because of actions they've taken, or indeed sometimes inaction they've taken, just simply holding on to assets. And it seems to me as though a very, very fair policy might be that of 98, 90, 95, 100% inheritance tax. That way you take away the ability for families to pass on generational wealth to people, and everyone then starts out on a level playing field. And that actually quite easily would take away a lot of this asset bubble, because people would have to start doing their own things and earn their own money. And so an asset, you might actually start leasing properties as opposed to owning property, because you want to consume the wealth that you have during your lifetime. It would take away the value of inherited wealth and take away the value of financial assets in many respects, or real assets like that.
There are very few topics in political circles as incendiary as that of estate taxes. And
yet politicians go the other way at the moment.
Apparently, we have two highly progressive liberals on, discussing the virtues of inheritance taxes. At an ideological level, I definitely concur. The main argument against that seems to be that you're taking money from families and giving it to governments, and governments. It is now fashionable to dismiss the virtue.
That doesn't need to be the case, because people might consume it over their lifetime and not accumulate.
Oh, no, for sure. The incentives for future earners will be to consume it, but you've got a vast amount of accumulated wealth that will go to the government instead of to, the next generation of people in that family. Of course, it doesn't need to be that way. In fact, the mechanics of the financial system are such that taxes in no way pay for spending. So we could literally take the wealth that is literally sitting up in that financial cloud, that is not being put to productive use at the moment, that's mostly sitting in money market funds supported by the U.S. Federal Reserve through reverse repo facilities. And we're just going to take that, we're going to hand it over to the government, and the government is just going to delete that money from existence. It just completely gets deleted. And the government just continues to go on spending because, the government passes a spending bill. It goes to the Federal Reserve. It says, the Fed, we need you to create this money for us and put it in this spending account. And then we're going to use that to fulfill the obligations of this policy bill. There's no connection between taxes and the money that is spent by the government.
That's probably why there's so much disenfranchisement. We see our taxes not buying what the services that we expect of them, and therefore we say, why are we paying taxes for something we're not even really getting?
Sure, and I think there's a lot of merit to that, and this is This is a question of how deep is a hole, right? Like we could spend all day on this and not make any progress.
Well, there you go. You started off by saying that you were a substitute, and I said, well, you're going to create public policy here in Cayman on the show, and we've come up with a policy which is to introduce an inheritance tax and help refine the opportunities that exist in Cayman. That might not be the most popular policy, but maybe in 20, 30 seconds, do you think that the age of disinflation could continue because of AI?
I think we're going to be faced with some really interesting choices over the next few years. I think 99.9% of people have not interfaced even a fraction of enough of time.
Put my hand up on that one.
To see just how powerful these new AIs are. I've spent an enormous amount of time using them, and it is a very exciting future from that perspective, but we're going to have to make some interesting choices from labor.
That is a topic for another show. We must get yourself and another person on and have a round table about the uses of AI, not the big picture uses of the future in 30 years, but just the practical steps every single listener should be doing or thinking about doing to familiarize. It's rather
Absolutely.
like, if you'd never familiarized yourself with the Google browser or the Netscape browser, where would you have got to if you'd known more at that time? So unfortunately, our time, though, this morning is up. We have extended our welcome here at Radio Cayman. Adam, thank you very much for joining, and it's been a pleasure having you.
Thanks, Simon. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Look, last thing I'll say to any listener, if you have any topic you want us to cover or any suggestions, please send us an email at moneysense@cfacayman.ky. With that said, it just remains for me to say thank you for joining us, and do tune in again in 2 weeks' time for another episode of Money Sense.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.